and gentlemen, of course, thanks for your questions. So please keep them going as we're now heading into our panel discussion, a high-level panel, and really thinking on how to rethink transport policies now in the times of the recovery. We'd like to speak with leaders from Asia, Africa, and Europe on the link that we just tackled on between the transport decarbonization and the socio-economic post-COVID-19 recovery. As I mentioned before, please be engaged. Please share your thoughts and your questions in our chat. The calls for a green recovery from the pandemic crisis are really loud and clear, as we heard now in these first moments of our Transport and Climate Change Week. It is a dual challenge of recovery and decarbonization that must be tackled in a very integrated way. And however, the question is it really realistic to expect countries to spend more and more for sustainable transport when the public debt is rapidly increasing, or when other development priorities are just as urgent? You know, where do we put and focus on in the end? What role could pricing policies play for changing transport systems? And of course, when we talk about trust and fears that we were just diving into with Professor Dr. Dirk Messner right now, what new mindset should the transport policymakers adopt now to open the doors for decarbonization? As I already introduced him, Dr. Dirk Messner is with me, and he stays for the panel discussion. And we do have Dr. Shaila Napalang with us, currently the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Project Development of the Department of Transportation in the Philippines, and an Associate Professor at the UP School of Urban and Regional Planning. She's one of the core members of the Women in Transport Leadership. A warm welcome to you, and thank you so much for joining us today at the Transport and Climate Change Week. Thanks for joining us. And we do have, oh, this is wonderful to watch. I would love to be in a tulip field as well. Well, welcome to Mariette van Empel. It's lovely to have you also on board. And thanks for joining us with this colorful explosion. You're the Director of Sustainability Mobility at the Dutch Ministry of Infrastructure and Water Management. And your main focus is on stimulating transport decarbonization, like electric passenger cars, zero-emission public transport and logistics, biofuels, cycling, walking as part of the mobility mix. And we already tackled about that in our keynote and in the last 10 minutes in the Q&A about the short distance. So I would love to hear more from you in a second as well. When I'd like to start now with a little opening remark session. I mean, Dr. Dirk Messner just had his time, so I would skip you for a moment and head over to Dr. Napalang. On a scale from 1 to 10, talking about your government's current appetite and, of course, also willingness to direct public sector investments towards what we're discussing, towards an environmentally friendly transport, which political opportunities have emerged from your perspective for sustainable transport that were not there before? That is really a change that you see when we talk about this environment-friendly setup of a transport.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for this opportunity. On a scale of 1 to 10, I would like to say that the Philippine government is 10. It's a score of 10. In the nationally determined contributions, in the interventions that we submitted for the nationally determined contributions, 3 out of 4 are actually on public transportation. You know, we have Public Utility Vehicle Modernization Program, the bus rapid transit, and rail. We intend to increase our rail lines from 77 kilometers to about 1,200 kilometers in 2022 and beyond. Why is that important in terms of, decarbonizing? It's because public transportation will now encourage the movement of people, right? Because right now in the Philippines, our modal share is about 70% public transportation. So if we improve that, we are actually able to move people without necessarily huge energy consumption, right? We also have we just also adopted the Philippine Urban Mobility Program, which looks at people-first approach, which will reduce the negative impact on the environment and the health on human health. What is new though? I think the pandemic has actually brought to the fore the importance of active transport, which I think is very important. Also, when we talk about reducing carbon footprint from the transport sector. The pandemic has increased awareness, has refocused the programs for active transportation. And also we've seen a rise in the number of legislative support, which I think is very important, legislative support for improvement of active transport. Yeah. We've also adopted during the pandemic, actually, the service contracting. Service contracting means that we pay, we will contract with the operators so that there will be a reliable public transportation service during the time of the pandemic. So it shifts the focus from passenger kilometers to vehicle kilometers. And so therefore, this is, I think this is a big shift, because people have to move somehow. And with the pandemic, we have seen people move towards the active transportation. Again, what's also important is that we've seen a convergence, a coordination of the different government agencies towards the promotion of active transportation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Napalang. Thank you for your insights into that first opening statement. Ms. Van Empel, I'd like to head over straight to you. We were just tackling a few bits and pieces right now, but from your perspective now, we are still in the midst of the pandemic, but this post-COVID recovery that we are aiming for and that we are hoping for, will that help us with the transport decarbonization? And do you observe from your perspective, from your working field, a shift in the priorities of transport policymakers across countries, across cities, across perspectives? Oh, would you unmute yourself? I can't hear you right now. I'm sorry. Now you're there. Wonderful.
Okay. Thank you very much for the invitation. And like you have said, we have two crises. We have the pandemic and we have the climate. And I think that's very important that we should not make us forget the last one, because the race to zero is inevitable, and it's also possible and beneficial. So what we see in the Netherlands, and also we as chair of the Transport Decarbonisation Alliance, where cities, companies, and governments are working together. We want to try just to keep all those good opportunities which are happening and keep them at the moment in space. So what we have seen that the changes in the mobility patterns the last several months, we have been looking for years, and now they are easy to realize. So what we see in the Netherlands is, and I heard also from Dr. Sheila Napalang, the same in the Philippines, people are much more working from home, which decreases emissions and use of resources, but also the use of active mobility, which is coming into a kind of normal. In the Netherlands, we are famous for our biking and a lot of bike lanes. But there has even been in the Netherlands an enormous increase of walking and cycling. And so people are buying much more bikes, e-bikes, and that's, we really want to avoid the motorized travel. And we hope that in the near time, we can keep this change of patterns, and that we're not going back to normal or the old normal. And we hope that people are still using their bikes and walking to work. What's also, I think, very important is to get a shift from the goods and persons from the motorways onto rail. And to stimulate that as a government. And if what we see in the Netherlands, we really want to accelerate the electric mobility. And what we have seen that it's very pivotal to use the charging infrastructure. If there's no charging infrastructure, then it's difficult to get this acceleration on the electrification on the mobility. And at the moment, we are, I think, one of the leading countries in having a charging infrastructure for passenger cars. And now our challenge is to get enough charging infrastructure for the transportation. So those are, I think, for this moment, the main points for the change which we are making in the Netherlands.
Thank you so much, Mariette van Empel. Thanks for actually showing us a nice picture, of an increased old normal of more bicycles and more mobility. It hopefully stays that way, and hopefully it's not a wishful thinking. Of course, you tackled also the infrastructure, the charging infrastructure that also Professor Messner was pointing out earlier. So this is something we can head into and dive into in our panel discussion in a moment as well. I warmly welcome now another guest who's joining us for our panel discussion. So thank you again for joining us. Amitabh Kant is with us, presently posted as the CEO of the National Institution for Transforming in India, and he's also the author of Branding India, an Incredible Story, Incredible India 2.0, and he's part of several campaigns which positioned and branded India and Kerala state as a leading tourism destination. So His Excellency, I'd like to forward the next question to you. After the strong, let's say, surge of coronavirus cases, and of course in India, when we watch the news and when we look into the numbers in the past month, the numbers are now falling again. Nevertheless, the Delta mutant, the Delta virus is still around. What is, from your perspective, the biggest challenge in the transport sector at the moment? And of course, when we just look on what is the current status, also asking what are your plans and actions to revitalize the sector in a sustainable but also in a resilient way? His Excellency.
Let me first thank you for having me here and for touching upon an issue of such topical importance in the current context. The transport sector forms the backbone of connectivity, and by virtue of providing a channel for the movement of people and goods, it is the key pillar of the economy. I feel that a big challenge which has been witnessed by the transport sector is the shift, actually, and very adversely, is the shift from public to private modes of transport on account of COVID-19 situation. Given that people fear that the risk of contracting the virus is higher in modes of public transport. And this phenomenon is not unique to India. It is being witnessed across the world. Of course, I do believe that this shift is totally, is not irreversible in the long run, but we should see this as a challenge. We should see this as an opportunity. And there is a need to push for clean, shared, connected, and cutting-edge mobility solutions. We released the policy for faster adoption of electric mobility policy for the faster adoption and manufacturing of electric and hybrid vehicles in India. Our objective is really to push for electric mobility and for having shared mobility as buses and three-wheelers. India is essentially a destination which has two-wheelers and three-wheelers, and therefore the policy aims to push for much larger subsidization of two-wheelers and aggregation for three-wheelers and buses. And this will over time bring electric vehicles at par with ICE vehicles through price neutrality. We've seen during the pandemic, sales of electric two-wheelers have continued to grow, signaling a very strong wave in favor of EV adoption. And we've actually created a differentiation between ICE vehicles and electric vehicles in terms of the goods and services tax. And therefore, from the government side, we've also given a huge incentive. We've also introduced a production-linked incentive scheme for advanced chemistry cell battery for achieving manufacturing capacity of 50 gigawatt of advanced chemistry cell and 5 gigawatt of niche is advanced chemistry cell so that we are able to push for battery manufacturing. And that is critical because battery is the key. We've seen the cost of battery falling rapidly from $1,000 per kilowatt hour to about $136 per kilowatt hour, and which will continue to fall to our mind so that there is greater uptake of electric vehicles in the country. On a separate front, we have a very ambitious infrastructure pipeline where a huge focus has been laid on electric mobility. And I would personally think that in India, we have only 25 cars per 1,000 people, unlike America, which has 900 cars per 1,000 people, and Europe, which has about 800 cars per 1,000 people. And therefore, India in the future has very few legacy issues, unlike America and Europe. The movement from ICE combustion vehicles to electric mobility will have to see a massive destruction in America and Europe, whereas India will have no legacy issues to move from. And therefore, it can transfer towards a clean, shared, connected, and an electric mobility world easily. And therein lies the real heart of the development of sustainable and innovative transport infrastructure. My belief also is that along with this, we need to push for cycling and walking, because they are the best modes of transportation. And therefore, buses aggregation, three-wheelers aggregation and bringing down prices, and two-wheelers increased subsidization, and pushing for better infrastructure and ensuring that there is battery charging available everywhere, including residential blocks, is the real focus for India. Thank you.
Thank you very much, His Excellency. Coming back to the studio, Professor Dr. Dirk Messner, when we look ahead into these developments, and of course when we look into nations with a high population growth, transport will be necessary. Transport will be not just going away. When we look into the African context with a population rise and growth of more than double until 2050, when we just listened to His Excellency from India. So talking about taking the bike or walking, is this the solution that fits all contexts, that this is the context that actually helps us to tackle transport within that climate change?
I mean, 2-3 ideas around your question. The first one is, I agree with Mr. Kant, who mentioned that there is a chance for leapfrogging. So in India, in the Philippines, in developing countries, directly towards decarbonized infrastructures, because the legacy with private cars driving mobility systems is less strong than in industrialized countries, obviously. So moving directly, making this step rapidly towards sustainable mobility systems. No? I agree on that. The second issue is that, I mean, it sounds a bit, it's interesting for me that during the last very few years, walking and cycling again is becoming modern. No? It seemed to be unmodern only a decade ago. We built cities around our cars in the European context after Second World War. No? In the US, exactly the same story. And now walking and cycling becomes an integral part, a systemic part of our mobility systems, as Mrs. Van Empel told us in the case of the Netherlands. No? So these are two important aspects of what you are asking.
Van Empel, Ms. Van Empel, I'd like to come in with you now and head over, of course, again, what you've just said. You know, when Mr. Kessler was just saying walking and cycling is having a trend again. I mean, in the Netherlands, you are for ages and of course for years fans of bicycles and of walking. So how do you actually combine the long-term distance and the long distances then, you know, that you find the right balance? Because of course I understand that the infrastructure needs to be set up for both opportunities, for the short-term distance and of course for the long-term distance. So how do you actually keep the balance?
Yeah, exactly. That's a very good point, because most of the time when we cycle, it's for about 5 or 10 kilometers. And we are investing in electric bikes and electric fast lane bikes. So, for example, people can commute to their work if it's about 15 to 30 kilometers, because you even have fast electric bikes, so that might be more possible. So fast biking lanes are one of the very important things. But on the other hand, we have, of course, the public transport. And like has been said already, that the ridership and the revenues are really collapsed in the last 2 years. But we are really looking how we can get the public transport back again. And if we get it back again, we also invest in hydrogen and electric buses. And even in hydrogen trains, there are some pilots. So I think the research and development on those kind of things are very important. But if we are looking also at the employers, they are agreeing on, for example, having their employees 2 days in the week going back to the office, and, for example, staying 3 days a week working at home, if that might be possible. And if they are traveling, we try to stimulate them not to travel during rush hours, but to travel later on. Just first start doing your emails and then going back to work. So all those kind of things we are trying to do. First of all, also to avoid congestion and to avoid mass people in public transport. And on the second hand, we are deploying the investments in electric passenger cars, but also in trucks and lorries and public transport.
Thank you very much for also bringing up the connection between work environment and, of course, method of transport. I'd like to head over to Manila again, to Dr. Napalang, because, of course, when we talk about bicycles, I would also talk about your bicycle boom in the city of Manila. As in many other cities around the world, there has been a bicycle boom in Manila. How are you sustaining this, rather positive behavior change, and also how do you support it from the government side?
Thank you. We've always said that the pandemic has brought about a tragic consequences, but it did give us an opportunity to mainstream active transportation. And the government has been cognizant of the importance of active transportation. In fact, in the funding that was made available for economic recovery, part of the funding was for the construction of bike lanes. Important, of course, is infrastructure support. So we're looking at building 480 kilometers of protective bikeways, not just in Metro Manila, but in other key cities, right? So that's one. The other way that we're sustaining this, of course, is we cooperate with a lot of cycling groups, because it's important for us to understand cycling from the perspective of those who actually cycle, and to also help increase awareness of how to cycle safely, particularly in urban areas. That's very, very, very important, right? Another way is, apart from just the cycling, I think somebody mentioned earlier that, we could cycle for like 5 to 10 kilometers. We considered it as a short distance or middle distance biking. But we also need to support this, we also need to connect this to what we call trunk line transport for longer travel. So now we're actually exploring what we call putting up of bike racks in our public transport stations, in our rail stations. So people are actually encouraged to use bicycles to go to stations. And you can see this. I mean, you can see this practice a lot in cities like Tokyo, where they have bicycle racks in their stations. So that's another way of actually sustaining it. And another program that's part of the Bayanihan 2, which is the financing mechanism that was made available for a post-pandemic recovery, is also the implementation of what we call the bike sharing program, so that people who may not be able to, so that we would also, discourage, for people who don't have bikes, they can actually make use of bikes using this bike sharing program. So it's actually a combination of infrastructure, policy, as well as a general social marketing. So we are able to also change the mindset of people towards cycling. Cycling has always been considered a recreational activity. Now we're shifting it to utilitarian, so that you can get to where you need to go using active transportation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Napalang. And you just mentioned a very important key point, and this is mindset. And that's where I'd like to go back to Mariette van Empel, talking about mindsets of policymakers within the transportation sector and the mobility sector. So what new mindsets from your perspective should be, or should transport policymakers and should adopt now to open the door for decarbonization? So when we talk about policymakers, do they need a new mindset? Are they on the right path? Or would you say, okay, now we do have a homework list, this is A, B, C to do?
No, I think most of technically everything is possible. So I think the most important thing is how can we change the mindset of the people using the transport? If it's you or me going to work, or going to visit family, but more important also the city logistics. So I think the mindset is very important, and then we have to probably have some regulations also, because we see that it can be done, but now we have to do it. And keep all the good practices. And we, for example, in the end of the year, we have the COP26, and there is also a main focus on transportation. And we hope also that in the national plans from all the countries, there would be much more attention for transport decarbonization, because it's possible it can be done.
Thank you so much.
And maybe just one thing. We have asked the World Resources Institute to make a study, and it's called Steering a Green and Healthy and Inclusive Recovery. And I think that one is very interesting for a lot of listeners, because that shows what can be done for this green recovery. And I will make it somewhere on the website that everybody can find it.
Yeah, absolutely. If you have questions, ladies and gentlemen, just send a message, of course, in our chat to Mariette van Empel. Mr. Kant, His Excellency, I'd like to bring you back into our discussion, because when we talk about new mindsets of policymakers, it's of course also crucial to debate about innovations. And that's where I'd like to head the questions to you, because some in the public sector, they say, we should use the limited resources for the recovery to improve the existing transportation systems before we move too quickly into new innovations. And this is a question I'd like to ask you. Where do you see the balance between coming within or coming with new innovations into this new normal now in the post-pandemic world? And of course, how do we deliver the transport innovations? Maybe you have also an example to share.
Yeah. So, when cities were made in America, they were designed for cars, because American car companies bought over the railway companies and destroyed them. And therefore, the model of development was that you are urbanizing for cars and not for people. In countries like India, where the process of urbanization has just begun, and you are going to see 500 million people getting into the process of urbanization in the next 3 to 4 decades, the challenge is about planning, that your urbanization planning has to be designed on transit-oriented development. That is, all development must take place on the back of public transportation, and therefore urban design holds the key to innovation. And I'm a firm believer that governments must use a collaborative approach to deliver sustainable and resilient transportation systems in the country. The government should play the role of a facilitator in the development of top-class transport infrastructure. It should lead to sustainability in terms of emissions, but also the financial sustainability of projects will be much better if we do transit-oriented development. So I talked to you about the faster adoption of electric mobility policy and the production-linked incentive scheme, which are two transformational interventions pushing for electric mobility and for advanced chemistry cell battery manufacturing in India. India is also focusing on transit-oriented development in urban areas. All our upcoming metro rail projects in the country, we are doing about 50 metros in the country. We'll see a huge amount of growth around these metros. Last mile connectivity with these metro rails is being boosted through shared electric three-wheelers, which are cleaner and more economical than the combustion engine variants. And we are embracing electric three-wheelers, two-wheelers on our roads in a very big way. In a further boost to our last mile connectivity, buses, which form the backbone of public transportation in our cities. And lastly, my view is that in the long run, green hydrogen will be the future for buses and for commercial transportation. And therefore, we have a green hydrogen mission in the country. We strongly feel that long distance transportation will be driven by green hydrogen. We are also witnessing the rapid evolution of mobility as a service. That's MaaS. We are seeing the faster adoption of a national common mobility card. This enables seamless travel by metro rails and other transport systems across the country without the need for cash payment or multiple city passes and bus permits, besides allowing for retail shopping and purchases, giving an added incentive to users.
Thank you, Mr.
So
Kant.
basically, my view is good design, good public transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Kant. Before we're heading into your chat questions, ladies and gentlemen, so thanks again. I do see them here. Keep them going. I'm looking forward to actually forward your questions in a second. Mr. Messner, a few points were raised that were quite crucial and very interesting, talking also about different responsibilities when we look ahead into what we are aiming for, talking about a facilitator role, talking about a responsible role. So where do you see, who is responsible actually now to go on with our development that we are aiming for a low carbon emission world, for a green recovery? Do you see somebody particularly in that so-called facilitator role? Do you see a responsibility more in the private sector coming ahead? Or where do you see who is actually in charge and who needs to be in charge and who needs to come to the table and to debate with each other? Because I see different stakeholders are coming together and sometimes the roles are not quite clear.
Yeah. I mean, I would talk about different layers or levels of responsibility. So the first layer is ourselves. We have been talking about mindsets. We have been talking about individual responsibilities and decisions. And people, the two of us, we can make decisions. We can buy still a huge, big car with a fossil engine within it, and this is a decision, an individual decision. So this is the first element. The next element is then our cities. And we talked about that. How can we build city mobility systems with high connectivity where it is easy to move from one mobility element and puzzle to the other one? And a lot of things are to do there. So the city level is important. On the national level, you talked a lot about balance, balancing different types of mobility. I mean, we need balance, but on the other hand side, we have a clear point of reference, which is decarbonization. The clear point of reference is towards mid of the century, zero emissions in the transport sector. And this is something where nation states play a major role. So on the national level, the national frameworks, pricing CO2 emissions, this is what there is necessary. And then we have been talking already about international cooperation. And as we said that urban infrastructures and urban population will double in only 3 decades, international cooperation in this field, to move this whole package towards one direction, decarbonization, and then affordability and equity. This is a huge task, and we need much more emphasis, therefore, in international cooperation for decarbonized and equitable transport systems.
And on different shoulders, as I understand it correctly.
Yeah.
Let's head over into our questions. So I'd like to, the first question goes to you, Mr. Kanda. I'd like to forward the first question to you. Do you believe that in India now is a need to initiate a long process for migrating to renewable electricity for e-mobility? Mr. Kanda.
Yeah. So my view is that we are going to see a huge movement towards electric mobility. In the future of mobility lies in the evolution of shared, connected, clean, cutting edge, and autonomous modes of transport, and the evolution of mobility as a service, all of which are backed by government-public collaborative approach of design, financing, and which incorporates the principles of resilience and sustainability and user friendliness. My view is that there will be a huge disruption. The cost of battery will continue to fall. The initial cost of two-wheeler and three-wheelers without subsidization will come on par with combustion vehicles in the next 18 months. And therefore, electric mobility will take off in a very big way. And secondly, I think newer innovations and new technologies on battery manufacturing, on advanced chemistry cell, will bring in greater levels of disruption. And thirdly, my view is that as far as commercial vehicles and buses are concerned, there will be a huge shift towards green hydrogen, CNG and LNG. But in the long run, my belief is that the green hydrogen really holds to a cleaner future, and we are all heading towards a zero emission world in the future, and therefore technological disruptions will take place and enable us to bring in clean vehicles and rapidly facilitate last mile connectivity. And to my mind, we'll have a mobility system which will completely move away from combustion vehicles into a mobility system which will be shared, connected, and electric. And to my mind, we will continue to support and promote the uptake of clean mobility solutions in India. The disruption will accelerate the pace. There will be a huge opportunity for using technology to leapfrog and really change the way we travel and the way we live. Thank you.
Mr. Kant, I have a follow-up question right from the chat, goes right to you as well. Why are bicycle lanes still so rare in major cities like Delhi?
That is because, like most developing countries, India also adopted the American model of urbanization. This model is now dead and gone. Those cities were made for cars, and as I said, not for people. And increasingly, all our cities will have to be redesigned. Every single city will have to be redesigned for transport-oriented development and for cycling and walking. There is the way to really travel is through cycling and walking, and every city has to necessarily have cycling lanes for the future.
Thank you very much. I'd like to forward that question also to Dr. Napalang. How do you actually tackling that moment of redesign? Where do you see the priorities of making the cities and, of course, the infrastructure greener, so to say?
That's an interesting question, because what had happened in the Philippines was that the need came before the redesigning, because we saw that there was an increase in the number of people who used the major thoroughfares. So therefore, what we did was we actually responded to this particular need. So therefore, we started looking at what we call road rationing. So it had to redesign which portion can be accommodate, which part of the road can actually accommodate cyclists. And of course, without prejudice to the pedestrians, because we're always talking about cycling. But of course, part of active transport will have to be those who walk for short distances. So we looked at that need, and we started doing road rationing, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. I'd like to head over to another question to Ms. van Empel. And I know we're here on a speed run right now, but we do have so many topics to cover. So excuse my speed now. Mariette van Empel, I'd like to ask your questions from the chat. First of all, from Ms. Trang Trunong, a big thank you to you for the interesting presentation and the view on the importance of the infrastructure for cycling. We were diving into that. In Vietnam, we are quite impressed. We are developing a technical guideline for bicycle infrastructure design. May we send the draft version of this technical guideline for getting your and your colleagues' comments and advice for improvement? That is number one to you.
Of course, we will be gladly to do so. Yeah,
that's lovely.
And maybe, but you want to ask something more or not? Otherwise,
I do have another follow-up question from the chat. It's just wonderful to connect virtually via different time zones now. So you two, you are connected. So please, yes, send the draft to Ms. van Empel. And another question is electricity the best alternative for future decarbonizing, including heavy-duty vehicles? For example, when we talk about trucks, what is your take on that?
Okay, first I just want to make a quick remark on the bicycle lanes and also on what Dr. Sheila Napalang said, because there's in Utrecht, and I think Dr. Messner also mentioned it, a very a good example of having a priority to bicycles in streets, and that's the urban planning, and not to cars. So the car is to visit, and the biker is the head priority. So that's, I think, a very interesting urban planning thing. But now the question about the heavy-duty transportation. I think it's very possible to have also electrification on heavy duty, but we are really looking into hydrogen at the moment. So I think you should first try to make electrification on those vehicles which are possible. And the really very heavy, or for example, the shipping, we are looking much more at biofuels at the moment, and at a later stage, the hydrogen. So I think that are the steps we are looking into in the Netherlands. And also together with the Transport Decarbonisation Alliance, the alliance which I already mentioned. This is an international alliance with, we call the 3 Cs, cities, companies and countries. And together we work out these kind of decarbonisation ideas for heavy duty transport.
I hope we have another opportunity to dive into the 3 Cs on a different panel, on a different momentum, maybe on a different transport week. So thanks everybody for joining us today. As a closing round, I'd like to ask from you a hashtag. So when we look ahead, or when we think of the post-pandemic world from now, maybe in 1 or 2 years, the pandemic is not or is hopefully behind us, whatever that means, behind us. How will the transport system in your country, how will it have changed? What is your idea, and what is the new normal that comes up to your mind when I raise that question? Maybe you can give me one hashtag that we can also share on social media. And Dr. Dirk Messner, I'd like to start with you, because we had a lot of time now to reflect on what you've said in your keynote, but also, of course, in your questions and in your answers, and I would have loved to dive into the social cohesion topic, into the social inequality topic, but this is also maybe something that we can, focus on a different momentum, on a different part of the transport week. But when you look ahead 1 to 2 years, where do you see the transport and the mobility in Germany? So
it's now very brief, and it's a hashtag. A hashtag
question, is a very brief. Yeah. It's not a whole keynote.
I would have 3 terms for you. So it is walking, cycling, electrification wherever possible. This is and connectivity, obviously. These are the elements we need.
4 hashtags.
Yeah, 4.
Okay.
4.
That's very nice.
For a very complex issue, I think this is a complex reduction of complexity.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for joining us today,
Thank
Professor
you for
Dr.
having
Messner.
me.
Thank you very much. I go on with Dr. Sheila Napalang, heading to the Philippines, because now it's about almost very late at night. So thanks for joining us. What is your hashtag when you look ahead into 1 to 2 years?
Well, reliable, connected, and but I have to have cycling and walking. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Napalang. Thanks for joining us in this Transport Week. And Amitabh Kant, I'd like to ask you for your hashtag as well. What comes up to your mind in 1 to 2 years?
Mine would be clean, connected, cycling, cutting edge.
Cutting edge, yep, absolutely. Just noting it down for posting it later. Thank you, His Excellency. And last but absolutely not least with us, Mariette van Empel. What is your hashtag?
I would say healthy, Healthy and happy active mobility is the new normal.
Active mobility as a new normal. I'd like to close the discussion round here. Thank you very much for joining. Thanks for speed going through different topics. And I wish you all the best wherever you are by. Stay healthy and join us again for interesting topics and sessions here at the Transport and Climate Change Week 2021. Thanks for your participation. All the best to you. Thank you. Thank you very much for joining me in the studio, Professor Dr. Dirk Messner.